I really enjoy Resident Evil 4. Leon's nightmare kill fest through a quiet village in Spain has always been endearing to me. I didn't grow up with the game by any stretch of the imagination, but that lack of bias only strengthens my confidence in the game as a genuine work of game design brilliance. The creepy atmosphere that persists through the game's lovable, wacky tone, the satisfying impact of nearly every one of the weapons in the game, how the game's purposefully stiff controls create an undeniable anxiety during encounters that make up for the admittedly simplistic enemy AI. I've never finished Resident Evil 4, nor have I played it in quite some time, but its buttery smooth blend of stressful yet badass combat mixed with a story that revels in its absurdity come together to create an undeniable masterpiece. For some games past their prime, it can be a challenge to figure out why they were so beloved in the first place due to the fact that they were so influential that many games have come forth since the original's inception that improve on what made that classic so, well, classic in the first place. But not RE4. RE4 is still, to this day, something special. It's common knowledge that nostalgia is a symptom that works its way fast through fans of an aging game, whether that game is deserving of that nostalgia or not. You all know this. Chances are that if you're watching this video, you're well acquainted with the feeling of yearning for a game you loved playing in your childhood as both you and it get on in years. And when you eventually blow the dust off your aging GameCube, plug it in, and boot up your long untouched copy of Resident Evil 4, you find yourself in Wonderland. Ironic considering the game's nightmarish hellscape of angry old villagers and massive earth-shaking giants, their mere existence as inexplicable as it is imposing. However, you may find that not all of your enjoyment of RE4 this time around comes purely from how competent the game itself is. Instead, you may find yourself enjoying RE4 for an entirely new reason: your memories. This time around, when you initially gain control of Leon as Kennedy, your first thoughts aren't about how uncomfortable this forest path makes you, brightly lit but still somehow oh so unsettling. Instead, you find yourself awash with memories. A warm, fuzzy feeling wraps around your body like a hefty blanket as you relish in moments long past. How happy this game made you at 14. How unnerving this first walk through the forest was. The vast unknown that lays before once was cause for anxiety. Now its memory is cause for celebration. You once feared what was hiding at the end of the path, but now you know exactly what chainsaw-wielding maniacs await Leon in his perilous journey to save the President's daughter. It almost gives you a sense of smug self-satisfaction over your younger self. They didn't know what they were getting into, but you do. They didn't know what they were doing, but to you, Resident Evil 4 is your backyard. Even if your memory is a little foggy, you know how it ticks, how it responds to your actions. You know how this story ends. And you wouldn't have it any other way. So, given the fact that you're not a special little snowflake and hundreds of thousands of other people around the world have had this experience with Resident Evil 4, Capcom, in light of the success of previous Resident Evil remakes, decides to remake RE4. You, longing for the simpler days of childhood where you had to worry about naught else but killing fictitious virus-infected Spanish people in the safety of your mother's basement, are riveted by the opportunity to relive a bit of that comfort, now in shiny HD. Right. Like, for all intents and purposes, that is logically how that scenario should play out. You enjoy a game a bunch, hold it to an impossibly high nostalgia-fueled standard in your head, hear that it's getting a gorgeous remake, and jump for joy. That's perfectly logical. Even those who don't have an attachment to the original game have a reason to be excited. They hear about this legendary game from 2 decades ago that a lot of people on the internet swear by, but they don't exactly jump at the opportunity to play that classic game themselves due to a multitude of reasons. Maybe they don't have the hardware necessary to play the game if it never got ported to modern platforms, or maybe it is available on a multitude of platforms, but the game looks too dated now and seems like it might be a bit of a chore to get through considering how accustomed they've become to the conveniences of modern game design sensibilities. Either way, remakes like the RE4 remake gave these people the opportunity to play these legendary games for the first time while still giving longtime fans a reason to be excited. All is well. Or at least it should be. Because despite the very pretty picture I've painted of RE4 Remake's announcement and reception, things weren't actually quite so clear-cut. Sure, when Capcom finally unveiled this project to the public, there were plenty of longtime fans of RE4 who were practically salivating at the prospect of the game being brought back from the dead, outside of the standard ports to modern consoles. However, even before the Resident Evil 4 remake was revealed to actually be in development and was only a thing that was thought to be happening due to the success of the RE2 and RE3 remake, many fans were skeptical. Not necessarily because anybody was worried Capcom would fumble an RE4 remake. While that certainly is always a possibility with remakes, both the RE2 and RE3 remake were agreed to be fairly competent, so there wasn't really any reason to be worried on that front. No, certain fans of RE4 were worried for very different reasons. Reasons far more complex and muddy than what if they mess it up. These RE4 fans were skeptical of the Resident Evil 4 remake for a deeper reason. And I hope I can illustrate to you by the end of this video why their reasoning and fears are absolute bullshit. A little over a year after the game's release, the Resident Evil 4 remake has seen a lot of critical acclaim for many of the same reasons the original RE4 is praised to this day. A constantly unsettling atmosphere, terrifying enemies, tense battles in enclosed environments, a tough difficulty that managed to keep you on your toes while still remaining fair, a self-awareness not attempted by many other horror games, memorable characters, impactful and fun weapons, the list goes on and on. As is to be expected in a remake, it also improved on a lot of features of the original, not the least of which being turning the once infamous and ear-grating wailing child that was Ashley Graham in the original RE4 into a lovable and believable sidekick to Leon, now complete with actual character traits besides screaming at the player and a general tendency not to add anything of value to anybody's life. So, yeah, the RE4 remake turned out pretty good, I'd say, and I'm certainly not alone in that assessment. I don't mean to imply that no one could have any problems with the game, with or without regards to the original RE4, but I still think it's fair to say that if you enjoy the type of experience that Resident Evil games have been trying to offer for a while now, then you probably enjoyed the RE4 remake at least a little bit. So why have I seen a very loud minority of people shitting on this game as well as similar remakes recently for their mere existence? Why can I search Resident Evil 4 into YouTube and find a few very passionate people trying to convince me that not only is the Resident Evil 4 remake bad, but that it's a disgrace to the original's existence? Because these people I've found, let's charitably call it criticizing the RE4 remake, don't fall under the umbrella of criticism I outlined earlier, of people who don't like the Resident Evil 4 remake because of actual problems that exist within the game itself, like maybe some repetitive enemy placement or Leon's toned down and at times non-existent goofiness. No, these people are aiming for something far greater, and the easiest way to spot them is by their use of the word disrespectful. These are people who think that the RE4 remake's mere existence sullies the legacy left behind by the original game. As much as I would love to pick apart any one particular video or comment thread by these people, I don't exactly want to start a witch hunt for any one person. I don't respect the opinions that these people actually have that I'm going to spend the rest of the video outlining, but that doesn't mean I get any particular enjoyment from tearing down a specific person's work. I'll happily pick apart their ideology though. So, why do some people hate remakes on principle? Before I actually start to answer that question, let's decide on a name for this particular camp of remake-hating individuals. Purists. The reason I would prefer to call them this is to easily separate them from people who might be hesitant towards remakes for more valid reasons. For instance, I wouldn't call people who scoff at the announcement of live-action Disney movie remakes due to their poor track record assholes because, well, yeah, they're right. Live-action Disney remakes have been really bad for the most part, so I can't at all blame them for being skeptical about remakes, because I have no reason to believe that they hate remakes for reasons that don't make sense or don't actually exist. So without further ado, let's break down two of the most common bullshit arguments made against remakes that purists use. Numero uno. The remake doesn't need to exist. Purists believe that if an older game can stand the test of time, that implicitly means that a remake for it doesn't need to exist. Their reasoning for this point is essentially summed up by the often ill-used adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Even without acknowledging the point of graphical fidelity, this argument is still full of holes. Let's say that a certain game may hold up well gameplay-wise, but it's stuck on an old console. Sure, the developers could just simply remaster the game, using the term remastered here just to refer to a game that's mostly untouched except for some small visual improvements, i.e. not made from the ground up. But why not full-on remake the game if given the opportunity? Yeah, there's nothing wrong with a good old remaster, but if you have the time and the money to make the game look really good, as opposed to slightly better, and have greater freedom to make positive gameplay tweaks without having to work around the quirks of the original game's source code / engine, then why not, right? This is exactly what happened with The Last of Us Remake for PS5 and PC. That game absolutely did not need a remake, but the world isn't exactly worse off for its existence. If you really want to play a version of the game closer to the original, then the PS4 remaster is right there, but for the vast majority of people who just want to play the best version of the game, then the remake is there for them. Hell, that remake in particular even came with accessibility options that aren't present in the original game or the PS4 remaster. Accessibility options that I imagine were made using a version of the engine that's much closer to what they used for The Last of Us 2, which probably made it easier to backport the accessibility settings from that game into the first one. Maybe. I don't exactly know how game development works, but even without the accessibility argument, it still stands that the mere existence of The Last of Us Remake is only helping people. If you've never played the game before because you're a die-hard PC gamer, you get to play The Last of Us. If you're a long-time fan of the original game looking for an excuse to play it again, you've got yourself a really shiny trip down memory lane. If you fall under neither of those categories, then the most you have to put up with is people banging on about a game you don't care about for a while until the wave of excitement eventually blows over. I cannot spell this out enough. There is no conceivable reason for anyone to be upset about the idea of this type of remake existing. And don't misunderstand, I'm not saying that there's absolutely no room for critique for these types of remakes. You could absolutely have problems with how a remake controls compared to the original, how subtle gameplay changes may affect the overall experience, how a graphical overhaul may not have accurately captured the charm of the original game's look. When a game is trying to just remake the original game screen for screen, criticism related to how well the game directly translates to the modern era is valid. Hell, a remake could release just completely fucked with no excuse good enough for the broken state it releases in. Again, I'm not trying to say that a standard one-to-one remake can't be bad, or that you can't critique them. I'm just saying that the concept or mere existence of a remake isn't hurting anyone. Argument numero dos. It's trying to replace the original game. No, it's not. This is easily the biggest boogeyman argument I see being made by purists. The idea that a one-to-one remake, or even remakes that aren't one-to-one, as is the case with the RE4 remake, are trying to replace the original game. That somehow the existence of the RE4 remake is slowly eroding away at the memory of the original game from public consciousness. I mean, it's basically a borderline fucking conspiracy theory with the amount of leaps in logic you have to pull for that to actually be the reality of the situation in your head. Like, let's play a little game. If I were to ask you whether or not discussion around the original RE4 increased or decreased around the time of RE4 Remake's release, I'm pretty confident you'd say that discussion around the original game increased. Because of course it fucking did, why wouldn't it? Let me tell you what would have roughly happened had the Resident Evil 4 remake never existed. With no new Resident Evil 4 thing to talk about, the only way to talk about RE4 would be to discuss the original game within the context of itself, which, in terms of YouTube discussion, limits you to retrospectives and short comparisons to other games that have RE4-like elements. That's pretty much it. Maybe a few playthroughs pop up every now and then of people playing it for the first time or going on a nostalgia-fueled replay of the game. Maybe throw an exhausted speedrunning community in there for good measure. YouTube is by no means the only way that discussion around video games flows, but I think we can all agree that it's a pretty good metric of how culturally relevant any given game is. However, that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is the one where we got the RE4 remake. And you know what the existence of the remake led to? An absolute fucking renaissance of content and discussion surrounding the original Resident Evil 4. You've got YouTubers revisiting the game before the remake. You've got people playing it for the first time so they can recognize and appreciate all the changes made to the remake by the time it comes out. You've got people discussing how good the original was. You've got people speculating what's going to change in the remake, what's going to stay the same. I cannot stress enough how much the existence of a remake popularizes discussion around the original game. The only thing that may lead you to believe that people aren't acknowledging the existence of the original RE4 anymore is the proportion of people talking about the remake compared to the original, which, yeah, is going to have a pretty obvious skew. But the thing about that is that proportion only looks scary when you're looking at it solely as a proportion. Yes, there may be more people talking about the RE4 remake compared to the original RE4 now, but that doesn't change the fact that even with that skew, there are still more people talking about the original RE4 than there would have been if the remake didn't exist in the first place. The most the RE4 remake did to spit on the legacy of the original is to add an addendum to its title on Steam indicating the year it was released in order to avoid confusion about which version of Resident Evil 4 you're purchasing. So, what's the point of all this? Why do we have legions of actual grown-ass men arguing over the existence of a remake that they barely even have to acknowledge the existence of? A remake that in no way inhibits their ability to play that original game that they love oh so very much. I think it's because of nostalgia. I briefly addressed nostalgia in the beginning of this video in a way that I imagine most people will find fairly agreeable. Nostalgia is a thing that you get when you like an old thing a lot because it makes you yearn for simpler times. That is admittedly a fairly shallow and somewhat nihilistic view of nostalgia, but I think most people would still at least vaguely agree with that very loose definition. However, there is a slightly less innocent side to nostalgia. I don't think it's too hard to imagine that the nostalgia someone has for an older game can overwrite genuine appreciation that they might harbor for newer iterations of that game due to insecurity. I don't mean to get overly psychoanalytical here, but I don't really think it's too much of a stretch to say that this is a thing that humans experience, mainly due to the fact that I myself have experienced this type of insecurity before. Not with remakes per se, but it's not exactly uncommon for a game I'm excited for to come out around the same time as a much more popular one, which ends up taking away some attention from an already lesser known game just due to the timing of their releases. Because of this, I will sometimes basically fabricate a narrative about those two games in my head, that the spotlight was unjustly stolen away from my game that was actually deserving of praise and recognition, which is ridiculous, right? Like, obviously Animal Crossing New Horizons didn't try to sabotage Doom Eternal by releasing on March 20th, but when I'm caught up in the moment without someone to pull me out of it and explain to me how it was just a simple coincidence, it can be kind of hard to see the reality of the situation. Me stubbornly refusing to play a game I might like because it happened to come out around the same time as another game is in no uncertain terms just a childish emotional outburst. Me playing and enjoying Animal Crossing doesn't suddenly make Doom Eternal a bad game. I think something similar is happening here with purists. They played Resident Evil 4 in 2005 and loved it a lot. Eventually enough time passes without those people having actually played the game but still having those cherished memories that they build up the game in their head as some untouchable masterpiece. I don't really think this in and of itself is really at all a problem, but then the RE4 remake releases and these people come out of the woodworks to pick apart every little creative difference, to point out how disrespectful the game is to the original release, regardless of whether or not substantial creative liberties were taken. And they do this because they think by admitting that a remake is good, that they then have to admit that the original game sucked. Obviously, it's not true that just because a remake of a game is good, it somehow makes the original game bad, but it's pretty easy to prove that this is how some people genuinely think. One of the easiest ways to prove that this mentality exists is to look at one of the most obvious contradictory points made by purists. Look at discourse around a remake for a game that, for the most part, tries to stay as faithful to the original game as possible. We can use The Last of Us remake again for this. It won't take long by digging through discourse about the remake to find people saying that the game's existence is unnecessary because it's so similar to the original game. There's nothing new here, just recycled content made to look prettier. They'll say that not only is making a re-release like this pointless, it actively disrespects the existence of the original game and its creativity by refusing to add anything on top of what was already there. Alright, sure, I fundamentally don't agree with that take, but I understand that someone could feel that way about this type of remake. So, by that logic, people would probably enjoy a remake that tries to do things a bit differently, assuming it's well made, right? Well, that's where the contradiction comes into play. Because for every person you see in online discourse who complains about one-to-one remakes, you seem to get an almost equal amount of people complaining about the relatively recent type of Resident Evil-esque remake that changes significant parts of the game's original story and game design, using the game's original blueprints as more of a vague guide and less as step-by-step instructions on how the final game should look. Here, instead of the argument being that the remake lacks a reason to exist due to how it adds nothing to the original, the argument becomes about respect. Here, purists will argue that by having the remake deviate so drastically from the original, it disrespects the legacy and intent of the original game. I'm not an idiot. I'm well aware that people are capable of holding one of these opinions and not the other in good faith. And you know what? If there wasn't such a large anti-remake sentiment going on in gaming right now, I'd probably believe that the majority of people who dislike a given remake on principle dislike it in good faith. But that outcry does exist, and therefore I can't help but doubt the good faithiness of those arguments. At some point I have to ask myself, when presented with a deluge of video essays about why seemingly all video game remakes must suck ass, how many of the people making these arguments genuinely believe that one type of remake is inferior to the other, and how many people flip-flop to either of those arguments in order to create a suitable straw man for their anti-remake agenda? Because, in their mind, if a remake improves on the original game, that would mean admitting that old classics have flaws, and that not all modern games are shit. Modern gaming is shit being a very convenient, albeit toxic way to convince your mind that your childhood meant something. Because why bother acknowledging that old games can coexist with newer games in terms of quality, when that would entail fixing a personality flaw of yours? No, I suppose it would be much easier to simplify the state of the games industry to new stuff bad, old stuff good. Why would you bother to take an objective look at the quality of a remake when you can just wave the flag of remakes being the final nail in the coffin of a creatively bankrupt industry? Why bother admitting you're a little nostalgic when you could just hide behind that nostalgia instead?